So I'm going to talk to you today about the way we ought to look at masculinity. The reason why this conversation is necessary is because the theory of masculinity put forth by academics like Michael Kimmel is proven to be technically and functionally insufficient, both for masculine individuals and society as a whole. One only need point to the growing concern with Peter Pan syndrome described by moral psychologists like Jonathan Haidt to illustrate this point. As far as I can tell, the idea that boys, and I use that term colloquially for all masculine individuals, need to be raised in a way that privileges certain canonical traits typically associated with femininity, such as emotional sensitivity, is not only theoretically and practically wrong, it is fundamentally damaging to the masculine psyche. It actually prevents boys from growing into the kind of men that society needs to flourish. People, as a generality, are monstrous beyond belief. Hobbes knew this and made as much known when he described human existence as nasty, brutish, and short. The question I am willing to ask, and I'm going to put forth today, is what kind of monsters do we, as society, want to raise, since it's hardly self-evident that the current model used to nurture boys into adulthood is working. My argument is that the kind of masculine monster that best serves society is a monster that is aware of himself and chooses not to be a monster, instead applying himself in such a way that he benefits humanity as a whole. But where do we look for such a model of masculine development? Carl Jung had a thought about this topic. In Sterquilinus Invenitor, in filth it shall be found. This might better be understood as that which is most important will be found in the place you least want to look. And if there's one figure in pop culture that best typifies the last place we'd want to look for masculine values, it's Mads Mikkelsen's portrayal of Hannibal Lecter and his relationship with FBI profiler Will Graham in the HBO series Hannibal. By stripping away the perverse horror of Lecter's actions against Graham and treating their relationship as an absolute value, we're going to explore the series' portrayal of masculine nurturing in such a way that praiseworthy facets relevant to the contemporary milieu might better be illuminated. But what does it mean to nurture? Cambridge describes nurturing as encouraging someone to develop, which has a positive ring at first blush, but loses its positive tone upon closer examination. Develop comes from the French word développer, which means to unveil or reveal the meaning of, particularly regarding individual potential. Encourage is a word evolved from encourager, which means to make strong. In this regard, masculine and feminine subcultures, which are oriented in part by the living traditions of the tribe, are only capable of nurturing viable members of a group when appropriate philosophies of apprenticeship are conceived and curated by the community as a whole. However, each requires a different mode of passage from childhood to adulthood. The question is, why? Assuming the essentialistic argument is true, females are naturally initiated into femininity by nature. The same cannot be said for boys. In order to properly assume their role in society, says Peterson, masculine individuals require an artificed event that destroys the unconscious union between child and mother and re-novelizes the environment by disintegrating the previously held personality and its associated modes of adaptation. Nurturing, in this sense, forces masculine individuals to adopt the hereditary personality of their culture, which facilitates the restoration of existential order sufficiently detached from their parental unit. So how does this paradigm manifest in Hannibal? Well, to begin, in order to talk about Hannibal Lecter, I also need to discuss Will Graham, since everything about the latter provides crucial windows into the philosophy and psychology of the culturally infamous former. Archetypally speaking, Graham is the revolutionary hero, the product of feminine nature and masculine culture. Personality is embodied by characters Lana Bloom and Jack Crawford. While these characters are undeniably important, they technically serve as set pieces for Lecter and Graham's relationship. Bloom and Crawford inhabit a mythological position in Graham's psychological hierarchy, something apparent in the way he differentiates between them and the other agents who he regards as peers. This distinction is easily obscured by the interplay between the two characters when Graham is not in the room. He does not see the concern that Bloom has for psychological fragility, nor does he see the faith Crawford has in him as a sufficiently matured man.
We analyzed the tissue. It matched Abigail Hobbs. It was her ear. Her blood under Will's fingernails, scratches on his arms are all defensive wounds. Like she fought back.
Shut up. Stop talking. He won't get too close. You said you would cover him. You could see he was breaking.
Yes, I could, and I kept pushing him. Because he was saving lives, Alana.
Not Abigail Hobbs's life.
You look me in the face and tell me that you couldn't see that he was breaking?
Of course I could see it. I told you not to put him out there!
Every decision I made concerning Will's mental health, I made under advisement of a respected psychiatrist who you recommended.
Graham himself is a unique kind of hero, more in line with the characters like Harry Potter, albeit much darker in his conceptualization. When Hannibal notes in the first episode that Graham has a knack for the monsters, what he's referring to is Graham's natural proclivity for human malevolence. He is a pure empath who can literally take on the perspective of serial killers and recreate their design in order to provide insights that lead to their capture. As a generality, humans are weedy regarding their ability to flourish in diverse situations. However, Graham's empathy disorder differentiates him from other profilers and allows him to be successful across a broad range of hierarchies. This ability to play his own game, as it were, is the part of Graham's psyche that draws Lecter to him, since Lecter interprets it as kindred to his own.
I shoot Mr. Marlowe twice, severing jugulars and carotids with near surgical precision. He will die watching me take what is his away from him. This is my design.
Please, no. Please.
I shoot Mrs. Marlowe expertly through the neck. This is not a fatal wound. The bullet misses every artery. She's paralyzed before it leaves her body. Which doesn't mean she can't feel pain. Just means she can't do anything about it. This is my design.
Lecter, on the other hand, represents the psychopomp, or shaman, who, according to Mircea Eliade, serves as an intermediary between man and the gods by guiding initiates through a ritualized ordeal. The transformative process of being compromised, suffering, death, and rebirth represents a return to primordial chaos as well as the resurrection into a new spiritual life within the tribe. Lecter is keenly aware of his role and makes as much known during later conversations with Graham after his symbolic rebirth towards the end of Season 2, noting,
"Every creative act has its destructive consequence, Will. The Hindu god Shiva is simultaneous destroyer and creator. Who you were yesterday is laid waste to give rise to who you are today.
How many lives have had to be sanctified? How many consciences devastated?
As many as were necessary.
You sacrificed Abigail. You cared about her as much as I did.
Maybe more. But then, how much has God sacrificed?
What God do you pray to?
I don't pray. I've not been bothered by any considerations of deity, other than to recognize how my own modest actions pale beside those of God.
I prayed I would see Abigail again.
Your prayer did not go entirely unanswered. You saw part of her. Well, should the universe contract, should time reverse and teacups come together, a place could be made for Abigail in your world.
place would that be?
You've lost a child, Will. It seems you're likely to gain one. God is beyond measure in wanton malice, and matchless in his irony.
The first season of Hannibal is dedicated to the first two stages of initiation and chronicles Graham's forced confrontation with a transcendental entity that systematically unmoors him from the idyllic conditions of his pre-initiatory state, in this case, the image of the chthonic stag. Lecter compromises Graham's psyche almost immediately. The first episode sees him gang pressed into service by Agent Crawford in order to profile and identify the Minnesota Shrike, Garrett Jacob Hobbs. While emotionally stressful for Graham, the Hobbs investigation precurses the event that menaces him most profoundly, the presence of a seemingly inaccessible copycat killer, Lecter, who subtly begins his ordeal by pointing the way to Hobbs. As if the ineffability of the copycat killer is not enough of a strain, Lecter and the viewers eventually learn that Graham is suffering from encephalitis, a condition hallmarked by disturbances of consciousness, cognitive decline, and epileptic symptoms, all of which, but most prominently the loss of time, are increasingly present in Graham's day-to-day life. However, Lecter hides the diagnosis from Graham and is quick to convince his healthcare provider, who he promptly murders in the grisliest of possible manners, to do the same under the pretense that it would lead to important, publishable research. In fact, he actually goes out of his way to downplay the severity of the situation by associating Graham's symptoms with latent mental illness instead of a potentially fatal condition. The first two stages of initiation and the first season of Hannibal culminate simultaneously with Graham's complete ostracization from his previous life and childhood personality, as well as his symbolic death, represented cinematographically in episode 13's final scene where Lecter visits Graham in a cell at the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Symbolically, the hospital is the telluric womb, or belly of the monster, and expresses regression to a preformal or latent mode of being. Death, in this sense, is tantamount to Prince Charming's dungeon in Snow White. It is the place that you never want to go, but the place you inevitably wind up before you get to where you need to be. As such, the asylum is where Graham's most dramatic metamorphosis takes shape. The ordeal strips him of his preconceptions about the world and how to deal with it, thus forcing him to learn new adaptive techniques, more suitable to the world as it actually is. Facets of his new personality emerge as early as the second episode of Season 2. He becomes subtly manipulative, acting as if he had finally bought into the possibility of being guilty and baiting Lecter into resuming treatment before returning to his cell and reassuming the countenance of a man with a plan of action. Graham is also more assertive with his own well-being, making quid pro quo arrangements with investigator Beverly Katz, not dissimilar from Lecter's arrangement in the 1991 film Silence of the Lambs. A series of deals, he argues, that are just as likely to further incriminate him as exonerate him. While I don't have the time to explore it in its entirety, Lecter also begins exhibiting atypical behavior because of his relationship with Graham. Despite his previous actions and outward callous demeanor, it becomes self-evident that Lecter actually cares about Graham and their friendship. Lecter's desire that Graham not be in jail for the murders he used to frame him with is, if nothing else, genuinely felt. And besides, he's already invested quite a bit of time in Graham's development. Allowing him to be pilloried and executed by the state would be an unacceptable course of events. Therefore, the new string of murders, committed to look like those of the original copycat killer, are Lecter's attempt to catalyze the final stage of Graham's initiation and reintegration into the world: resurrection. Hannibal is more than a simple crime thriller. It concerns itself with transcendental entities and worldly monsters, and as such, the resurrection of Graham, the individual, takes on new significance. His symbolic rebirth is more than a simple matter of reintegration into society. He is transformed, similar to how Francis Dolarhyde is transformed in the 2002 film Red Dragon. But what is the nature of this transformation? Mythopoetically, resurrection is the part of the hero's journey where the individual returns from his voyage into hell carrying the spirit of the Father. It is an integrative process of spiritual transmutation where complementary aspects of the individual and useful aspects of ancient wisdom are fused. Iliada, when speaking of Horus and Seth, states that this transmutation has an ennobling effect. However, Peterson argues that the return from the depths contaminates the initiate and sets him apart from his peers. I tend to agree with the latter sentiment. Graham returns to the world of the living tainted by the spirit of Lecter, something made apparent in the reactions he receives from his former friends, particularly Alana Bloom. This notion is concretized imagistically when he is shown growing antlers emblematic of Lecter's symbolic spirit. However, despite being touched by corruption, he has, at the same time, become capable of engendering order out of the chaos his ordeal has created. In sterquilis invenitur, in filth it shall be found. If we are being honest, the world is a filthy place, one filled with monsters. However, as painful as it might be to admit this, prolific monsters like Hannibal Lecter serve an undeniable purpose in the greater scheme of things. Lecter's purpose is to create monsters who are powerful and self-sufficient enough to deal with other monsters in the world. As such, I think it is worth considering that young men require similar mentorship if they are to be made aware of who they are and what they could be if only they would voluntarily undertake the challenge of their own development. They need to be allowed to suffer the consequences of their actions, the good and the bad, and not be coddled by overprotective social structures. The death of who they were as children is necessary, and this is likely the hardest part of the process, not for the individual himself, but for the immediate family, because that part of them that is destroyed is the thing that is typically cherished most, their vulnerability. In short, boys need to be allowed to become noble monsters, and that can only happen in the shadow of a properly conceived model of masculinity.